It is great to finally be done moving so I can finally get back to talking about books. And the book that I just read in the last month was The Failures by Benjamin Lyer. I'm struggling to figure out how I want to do a review for this because I generally don't love full spoiler free reviews. I really like to go kind of full spoilers to be able to talk about things. But this is also a debut book and it's brand new, and I don't think a ton of people are talking about it, so I feel like I shouldn't be talking spoilers. So we'll see how this goes. First off, it was pretty good. I liked it a lot, and there are a lot of reasons why I liked it, and we're going to get into those. First of all, I really like the structure of the book. Now, the structure of The Failures is what I would call puzzle box storytelling, also non-linear storytelling, right? There's a lot of, it's one of those books where it throws a lot of very different and random elements at you that are really weird and you're not really sure what's going on, and then eventually all those things connect. And what's great about The Failures is it's not that it does that in the sense that, oh, there's just a bunch of different POVs that eventually converge into one storyline. Although there's a little bit of that happening. This is different in the sense that there are different writing styles present through each of these POVs. There are different wacky world building elements for each of these POVs. Each of the different POVs at the beginning of The Failures feels like something pulled from a completely different book or completely different series. And like, if you didn't have the map that's in the first page of this book that name drops the locations, it would be pretty weird to figure out how any of these basically different storylines are even taking place in the same world. And honestly, I'd like to applaud that map at the beginning of this book. It's a very basic map. It's just a picture of the mountain that the book takes place on, and then there's like 3 locations that they name. And so when those name pops up, you know, oh, okay, so this POV is in this location of the mountain, this POV is in this location of the mountain. And it's just enough to know, to help ground you, and for you to know, okay, these are taking place on the same world, but even still, you're like, I don't even understand how any of these things relate to one another at all. I don't understand how any of this is even in the same book. And then through the course of the book, not that the storylines converge in a traditional sense, but connections between the different storylines are made clear. And I love that. That's why I call that like puzzle box storytelling. There's a lot of things that you have to piece together that you have to figure out. And then eventually the book will come out and tell you what these connections are in case you weren't able to figure it out. And that's immensely satisfying. And what makes an additional layer of this puzzle all the more fun to figure out is that it's not just that there are different, there are different storylines happening in the same world, and you'll eventually see how they all correlate to each other. There's also another added layer of non-linearity. So because this book will do that thing where, certain characters in one storyline may pop up in another, you're always on the lookout for clues like that. But what can make those clues really hard to spot is that things in The Failures are not happening in a linear structure. So different storylines are happening at different points in the timeline of events. And so it makes it extra hard to be able to figure out where those connections are, because even if you start to piece together that you think, one character in this storyline might be in this storyline, you realize, oh, okay, well, hold on, then what's the order of events? And then you start to piece together, oh, these things are happening out of order. And so there's those 2 layers to the puzzle that makes The Failures such a fun book to read, because when you start realizing that the storylines are connecting through similar characters or through same characters, and you start realizing that these things are happening at different points in time, then there's almost an element of paranoia in the second half of the book where you're like, okay, and you're starting to piece together who's who, is this person, wait, did that person, how did this relate over here? And it's really fascinating. And then when you finally think you have a handle on what's going on, a new element of the puzzle is thrown in to keep you on your feet and to keep you guessing. Even when you finish it and you feel really satisfied, there's still so much more that I'm excited to learn about, that I'm excited to solve. And I'm hoping that element will continue on into the future books. I'm hoping that puzzle box element is always going to be there. And I'm hopeful that it is. I hope that now that these connections aren't made, we're not just going to go to a straight, linear, simple storyline. And from the vibe I get, I don't think that's going to be the case. But that was my favorite part of the book. My second favorite thing was the world building. I think the world in Wonderlands is really cool, simply because it's just very unique. So this isn't like a typical, fantasy novel. It's not a typical sci-fi novel. It's kind of a blend of the two, plus a blend of cyberpunk, plus a blend of a little bit of the Dark Tower, plus a little blend of modern day real world stuff. There's just a lot of stuff that is mixed in here. And honestly, by the end, I don't have a lot of the answers on how the world of this works at all. There's giants under mountains, there's alternate dimensions and worlds and timelines. Our real world is somehow a part of this world too. And so there's just a lot of questions, right? It's very fascinating. But the main bulk of the storyline takes place, I think, in one world on this one mountain, and the mountain itself is, so large. It has multiple different cities and civilizations built on the outside of it, on the inside of it, underneath it. So even just the isolated mountain is very cool. When you get outside of the mountain, you get these really eerie descriptions of like the dark, oppressive sky. That's really cool because we're living in a world where the light has been destroyed. There's no sunlight whatsoever. It's just this oppressive like blanket of darkness. Yeah, there's just so much in the world building that's very interesting. It's eerie in some places. It's really cool when you get into like the magic, which is kind of cyberpunky. There's a lot of things in the world are made out of machinery and clockwork. It's just really interesting, right? That, like, this mix of like cyberpunk but like clockwork deal going on, and then all of that would be interesting on its own. But then you throw in that this is all part of like this multi-dimensional, large scale thing too. There are these doors that leads to other worlds. People from our world are brought into the mountain, and when they get brought into the mountain, they change into like basically an alien race of super beings, which is just like really interesting. Just a lot of crazy out there weird ideas that are all thrown together and make this such a unique read, a unique blend of all these things that are brought together, these inspirations and these ideas, to something that's totally different to anything I've ever read before. And as I'm going to talk about in a future video soon, I felt like this book was great for me to read now because it was a primer for me, as I just read for the first time The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. And I felt like the way that this world, the way it's written is, how it's kind of like a puzzle box and you kind of have to read through the lines and piece things together about what's actually going on. The Book of the New Sun is like that, but to a whole nother extreme. And I feel like the failures primed me for that level of needing to pay attention, needing to like piece these things together to really understand what was going on. And so, I would say this is like a good like halfway point, between something that's more simple and something like The Book of the New Sun. If you've never read that before, I think it was a good thing that I read this first because it kind of got me in that headspace. The third thing I liked most about the book was the writing. Now, the writing is very interesting in this book. One, there are different writing styles throughout the different POVs. For instance, one of the POVs is written in like a present tense, which is really interesting, and the rest are not written in the present tense. So like the way you distinguish storylines and POVs are often through like writing style, like the actual like changing the actual writing style, which helps differentiate between the different storylines. The way he writes characters and character thoughts is very different. So like one storyline is about this coming of age story, and it's written from the point of view of this 11 or 12-year-old kid. And the way it's written is great because you only understand the thoughts and the perceptions of this 11-year-old kid. And so you have to read between the lines to figure out what's actually going on in that storyline, because this 11-year-old kid doesn't understand all these things that are happening with these adults. And that's really fun. You've got like another storyline that takes place with these humans that come place from our real world, and the writing style is very casual, as if like just one of us would write something like this. The descriptions of the characters, the machines, the clockwork contraptions, all that stuff was just there enough for me to understand what was going on, but also vague enough for my imagination to run wild. I thought the descriptions of the world and the mountain were very eerie and depressive in some senses. Like I could really just feel what the characters were feeling in a very dark and depressing world like this. I suppose finally I should talk about the characters, and I feel like the characters are a little bit of a 50-50 split for me. I don't think I outright hated any of the characters, but usually there were some that I enjoyed and some that I was just kind of apathetic towards. If I were to pin like a main character, I would probably say, at least in this book, it was this character named Sophie. I think she's constant throughout all 4 parts of the book. And I didn't hate Sophie. I definitely liked her more by the end of the book, but for whatever reason, I just was having a hard time connecting with Sophie. And so what I liked about her story is that eventually I became invested because her storyline is connected to, I think, every other storyline in the book. So eventually, I'm interested in her storyline for those types of things, those puzzle box elements. For just whatever reason, she was just okay to me. But her storyline gets really cool when it connects to other things, because her storyline is really, it becomes like the key that all the puzzle revolves around. The characters that I really liked were those younger characters that I mentioned. That one storyline with the 11-year-old kid and his 15-year-old brother. That storyline is amazing. It's kind of, I think, like a little bit of a coming of age, a little bit of a thriller, a little bit of a mystery. That stuff is really cool. One, just the writing from the point of view of an 11-year-old who has anxiety was just really, really cool. And I love how you have to read between the lines on, the way he perceives things and what's actually happening. But two, his brother, the 15-year-old character, is probably my favorite character of the entire book. And that character is definitely key to pretty much all the other storylines, as you come to realize throughout the book. And what's interesting about him is you never get his perspective, but all these other characters and all the other storylines come in contact with him, and he's so different in each of the storylines that he is, in my opinion, the most fascinating character. Like, I want to know everything about him, while also at the same time not wanting to know, not wanting to know anything about him, because him being a mystery is really cool. But man, that character Chris is just one of the most interesting and well realized characters, I think, of the entire book. He is so fascinating. Every time he's on page or doing something, or when you retroactively look back and realize like who he is in different scenarios of the book, he just becomes, like, to me, the biggest, like, I want to know what's going on with that character right there. And in fact, while I think Sophie is the main character of this book, Chris is in some ways, I think, the real main character, because he's present throughout the entire story, even if you don't know it or when you begin the book. And that is fascinating. Just so many questions I have about him, and I cannot wait to explore him and what's really going on with him when we finally get to the next book. The other characters that I kind of flip-flop back and forth on, but I think I ultimately settled on really liking them, are the two characters who are from, like, our modern world, who are brought into the world of this book, Gunny and Jackie. They are very interesting. Sometimes they're very frustrating, but not like, like in a bad way. You're just like, you understand why they are the way they are. But man, sometimes they just like really frustrate you. But that's like a good thing, and it's a fun part of their book. And I remember when they were introduced, they're like a huge question mark at the beginning of the book. And to be honest, I think they're still a pretty big question mark. You kind of understand what has led them to where they are in the story, but you never outright see any of it. It's just alluded to. And so, the biggest question mark I have with them is, how did they even get here? How is our world connected to this world? Like, what's going on? That being said, like, this world building element where the implication that regular humans from our world who come into this world, into the Wonderlands, become these like ultimate divine, immortal, godlike beings is really fascinating. And I like the juxtaposition between the powers that Gunny and Jackie have, and just the fact that they're like bored young adults who don't know what to do with themselves, leads to some honestly pretty horrific things. And I like the exploration of the fact that, like, ultimately what can lead to some pretty insane levels of destruction and suffering can ultimately just come from boredom, basically. Like, people are bored, and so the way they seek to entertain themselves can lead to this horrific destruction and suffering that's brought on so many people. And I thought that was very fascinating. Unfortunately, there's one major problem with the book. I don't know if this is something that came about in the editing process, or if this is something that Liar put in on his own, but my biggest beef with this book is that oftentimes things will just be repeated from the previous chapter. So I'll give an example. So there's a chapter early on where Gunny and Jackie are fighting some machine beasts, and they kill somebody, and then they're running down the mountain. And their chapter ends with, hey, we've killed these beasts, we've killed this guy, we are running down the mountain because we are being attacked through mental powers of some kind, and we need to get away. And then, it'll hop POVs, it'll do something. And then when you get right back to Gunny and Jackie, for the first page and a half of their next chapter, they will just repeat the things that happened in the previous chapter. So their next chapter will open with, we were running down the mountain, and we were running down the mountain because we killed that guy, and we killed those beasts, and those beasts are after us, and we're being attacked mentally. This doesn't happen once or twice. This is almost constant throughout the whole book, especially the first half. So either this is an editing note because so much is different between the POVs that, like, maybe the editor said that, hey, we need to remind people about what's happening when they jump back into a new POV, so they're not lost. Or maybe that was the author's intention. Maybe the author did that himself, because maybe, Liar thought, because there's so much going on in this first half and I'm swapping between such different stories, I need to ground people at the beginning of each POV. But for someone like me, who I felt like was paying pretty close attention and who had a pretty good memory of what was going on, yeah, there's like a little bit of disorientation when you're jumping into a POV and you just have to remember, oh yeah, this is what happened at the last time I met Gunny and Jackie, right? Or, oh yeah, this is what happened last chapter with Sophie. Once I remembered that, then the book would stop and go, all right, let me recap what you just read in the last Sophie chapter. Let me recap what you just read in the last Chris chapter. And that was really annoying to me. And it was happening constantly throughout the book. I think maybe either the editor or Liar maybe didn't quite have enough faith in his audience to remember all the details and wanted to make sure that everybody remembered what was going on. But for me, it was really frustrating to feel like you know, probably around 30 pages of this book could be summed up in recapping things that happened in a previous chapter before we begin the real events of the chapter you're reading. And so that was pretty annoying to me, I have to say. But really, that was the only thing that was wrong. Like honestly, if you cut out these recap segments, I think the book would be pretty much perfect. So yeah, that's a huge recommend for me. I'm sorry that I had to do. I hate having to do spoiler free stuff because I'd really like just get in and just talk about the events and analyze the book. But I know that this is a debut book. I know this is a brand new book, and I know that this hasn't really found an audience yet. So, I would feel pretty bad if I immediately went into spoilers. But yeah, this book is really interesting. It's really good. I'm excited for the sequels. I can't wait to read them, and you guys should read it too.